Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're well. It's Rabbi Akiva Males. Today is Wednesday. It is the 29th of March, and we are getting ready for Shabbos Haggadah, Parshas Tzav. But because it's Shabbos Haggadah, that means Pesach is right around the corner. We're going to today, instead of focusing on the Parsha, we're going to focus instead on something from the Haggadah Shel Pesach, from the Pesach Haggadah. So let's take a look at the sheets, what you'll see in front of you on the screen and what was emailed out earlier today. You know how I love bringing in Divrei Torah from Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin. Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin, the author of the Aznaim LaTorah. So a few years ago, I found out that he also had a commentary to the Haggadah. It was called Hashir v'Hashevach. That aside from his commentary to the Torah, the Aznaim LaTorah, he also wrote a commentary to the Haggadah. It's called Hashir v'Hashevach. And I saw in my notes that 2 years ago, we shared some of the Divrei Torah that I saw that Rabbi Sorotskin had in the Haggadah. And today I want to share some more. We'll continue to explore some of what Rabbi Zalman Sorotskin, the Aznaim LaTorah, what he had to comment on our Haggadah Shel Pesach. We're going to take a look today at about three or four items that he has that will enlighten us in our appreciation of the Haggadah. So let's see. I've got us on page 2. The Haggadah opens up with a very cryptic paragraph. It's in Aramaic, and that's why some of it might go over our heads. But what we're going to do today is we're going to analyze it. We're going to take a look at what that paragraph means. Rabbi Sorotskin is going to point out to us that there's a number of contradictory statements in there, and you'll see how he makes sense of it. So let's look first at the paragraph. It's at the top of page 2. Halach ma'anya, it's in Aramaic again, and it means this is the bread of poverty, the achla avasana ba'ara de Mitzrayim, that our ancestors ate in Egypt. Kol dechvin yeseh v'echol, anyone who is hungry, let them come join us and eat. Kol ditzrich, anyone who's in need, yeseh v'yifsach, come and join us and be part of our Korban Pesach. And then it says hashta hacha, now we are here. L'shana haba ba'arad Yisrael. Next year we want to be in Israel, meaning now we are here out of Israel. Next year we want to be in Israel. Hashta avdei. Now we are servants or slaves. L'shana haba b'nei chorin. Next year we want to be people who are free. We want to be experiencing liberty. That's what the paragraph states. We may never have thought about it or looked into it long enough, but there are several contradictions in there. Let's see what Rabbi Sorotskin does. So he writes as follows: Halach ma'anya. Here's the paragraph of Halach ma'anya. Farivanu, we've already mentioned earlier. Shapiska hazos, this expression or this paragraph of Halach ma'anya, this kanab Bavel. It was originally established when the Jewish community was in Bavel, meaning during Galus Bavel, the 70 years in between the first and second Beis Hamikdash. We know what occurred at the end of that period was the Purim story. So during Galus Bavel, before the Jews went back to build the second Beis Hamikdash, that's when this paragraph was initially established. And you could actually prove it from the wording. Shabo nechtav, it says in there, v'namar, Aramit. It's first of all, it's written in Aramaic, which was the spoken language at the time. If this paragraph was fully written in Bavel, there's a problem. Look at the second sentence. Anyone who needs, meaning anyone who's not included so far in a Korban Pesach, let them join me. Such a sentence could only have been written when the Beis Hamikdash existed, because that's the only time we're bringing a Korban Pesach. That's when a Korban Pesach is brought. So there seems to be, the language seems to imply it was written in Bavel. But that sentence about anyone who needs a place for a Korban Pesach, come join us, seems to imply this is in Eretz Yisrael when the Beis Hamikdash was around. But on the other hand, look at the Lashon Hashta Hacha. Now we are here, Lashana Babar Yisrael. Now we are here, meaning outside of Israel. Next year we want to be in Israel. That seems to imply this was written when we were still experiencing Galus Bavel during the 70 years. So I've got parts of this that seem to imply that it was written in Bavel. Parts of it seem to imply it was written when the Beis Hamikdash was around. Ulam sofa lashon, but look at the end of the paragraph. It says hashta avdei. Now we are servants. L'shana haba b'nei charin. Next year we want to be free. Meramez, that seems to hint to Kenir al Zman bo kfar shavu l'Eretz Yisrael. That seems to be at the time when Ezra and Nehemiah, they return with the Jews from Bavel to Israel to rebuild the second Beis Hamikdash. El shayu avadim l'malchei paras, but they were still servants. They were still enslaved, you might say, to the kings of Persia. That's why we don't say Hallel on Purim, because we were liberated and we experienced salvation, but we were still slaves. We were still slaves to the king, to Achashverosh, to the kings of Persia. So it definitely, there's all these contradictions here. Like what Nehemiah said, Nehemiah and Ezra, who brought Bnei Israel back from Bavel to Israel to rebuild the second Beis Hamikdash, they comment that this is the land that God gave to our forefathers. But now we are servants upon it. We're not free. So Rav Sorotzkin is pointing out there's all sorts of contradictions in this paragraph. The language seems to imply it was written in Bavel. But then you have Kol Ditzrechei Sevei Esach. Anyone who needs come join us for the Korban Pesach. So if you're bringing a Korban Pesach, that means you're in Israel and the Beis Hamikdash is around. So it's not in Bavel. But then you've got this one that says Hashtahacha. Now we are here. Next year we want to be in Israel. That implies we're not in Israel now. But then you've got the end where it says Hashta Avdei L'Shana B'nei Charin. Now that we're in Israel, we're still not completely free because we're still slaves, servants to the kings of Persia. Next year we want to have a complete freedom. So this is loaded with contradictions. Parts of it are implying it's still in Bavel. Parts of it implying it's after Ezra and Nehemiah brought everyone back. What is going on? How do we make sense of this paragraph? So let's see what Rav Sorotzkin does. Yesh lomar, here's how we could explain it. Initially, the paragraph of Halach Mania was written for the Jewish community in Bavel during the 70 years of the Babylonian exile. When the Jewish community was living in abject poverty in Bavel. And Bnei Israel needed strength, they needed encouragement. So they don't become downcast and just totally throw in the towel. Matzav kasha lo nasar lo asid yoser tov, at a time where they don't see anything good happening in their lives, and you're lying, nothing seems to be on the horizon, nothing appears to the eyes where there's any help in the future. So at that time, in Golus Bavel, that's when our sages set up everyone we should say on Leila Seder, the night of the Pesach Seder. This, what we're eating now, this matzah, this is like the bread of poverty that our ancestors ate in Egypt. Klomar, what does that mean? It's almost like giving themselves a sense of encouragement. This is not the first time that we've been in a difficult exile. Think about the bitter time that we spent for a long time in the land of Egypt. And God redeemed us from there. Took us out of there. Certainly, certainly he'll take us out of this galus. So galus Bavel, which is the Babylonian galus, v'karu leila ha'aniyim, and they called out to anyone who was poor in Bavel. They didn't have what to eat at their Pesach Seder in Bavel during the exile. They didn't have anything prepared. They had nothing. We invited them, come celebrate with us, join us at our table. We could share some of our stuff with you. So that's in Bavel. The original part of Halach Manya was said in Bavel. And we were encouraging Jews. We know this is such a difficult time, but it's not the first time we've been in exile. We've been here before, and God took us out. He'll get us out of this one too. And Jews, I know there are people out there who don't have what to eat. So anyone who's lacking, come join us. And they end with a prayer. Hashtahacha. Now we are here in Bavel, not in Israel. Shana haba b'Eretz Israel. Next year we want to be in Israel. So those parts of it were totally written in Bavel. So again, which parts? Where it says Halach Manya Diach Lavasana B'Eretz Mitzrayim. So that part that says this bread, this is what we ate in Galus, and we're in Galus now. We were once in Galus before, just like God took us out then, He'll take us out again. Kol dechvini yaseh v'yechol. Anyone who's hungry, come join us, because there's a lot of hungry people in Galus. And then that third line about Hashta Hacha L'Shana B'Eretz Yisrael. Now we are here out of Israel. Next year we want to be in Israel. Those three sentences, that's the original part of Halach Manya, and that was made in Bavel. Now he continues and he says, but there were two sentences added later by Ezra and Nehemiah's time. It says, V'achar kach l'sov shivim shana, but then after 70 years passed of the Babylonian exile, kasher alu l'Eretz Yisrael, that when Ezra and Nehemiah led back to Israel, ka'arboim elef Yisrael, what the Navi tells us, only about 40,000 Jews joined them to go back to Israel. V'rov Yisrael nisharu b'kuf chav zayin medinas prasumadai. Most of the Jewish community remained behind in the 127 provinces of the Persian Median Empire. Hosifu kulam, then the rest of Bnei Yisrael added a few more lines to this. L'chvodem shel Yehudim olim, in honor of the Jews who went back to Israel, they added a couple more lines to Halachmania. Shebanu Beis Hamikdash, because the Jews who went back rebuilt the second Beis Hamikdash. Ve'ekrivu Korban Pesach, and they were able to bring the Korban Pesach. Hosifa shel Amilim, they added the following words: Kol ditzrich yeseh v'yifsach. Now that we have a Jewish community that exists in Israel again, the second Beis Hamikdash has been rebuilt, and there are Jews living in Israel. There's a Beis Hamikdash, so they're bringing a Korban Pesach. Now we can say Kol ditzrich yeseh v'yifsach. Anyone here in Bavel, we're saying, yeah, anyone who's hungry, join us for our meal. But to the Jews in Israel, we say, anyone who needs, join up with a family who's already bringing a Korban Pesach. They'll be happy to take you in. Now he throws in parentheses something important, because there's a problem with that. We all know that you couldn't just show up at someone's house to have a Korban Pesach with them. You had to have been part of the Chabura. You had to have been part of the original group who was planning on taking part in that Korban Pesach. You can't just show up unannounced. It doesn't work that way. So how does that work? That you say, Kol ditzrich yeseh v'yifsach. Anyone who's in need, join for a Korban Pesach. So he says as follows. Here's how he explains it in the parentheses. Bevadai amru zos anshe Eretz Yisrael lo rak b'leil seder. Those Jews living in Israel who were really bringing the Korban Pesach, they didn't just announce at the Seder time, Kol ditzrich yeseh v'yifsach. Everyone who needs, come join us. Because it's too late at that point. It's too late to start inviting guests to join you for the Korban Pesach at that point. A Korban Pesach can only be eaten, excuse me, by the ones who were originally counted in to be part of it. Elagam Boker, rather on the morning of the 14th of Nisan, that's when Mibod Yom, when the morning before the Korban Pesach was brought, his minuas orachim shein lam kesef. That's when they started making the invites to Jews who didn't have the resources to bring a Korban Pesach. So the Jews who did would invite them to take part with them. Lasos Pesach latzmon. Many Jews didn't have money to make their own. They invited them lishtatef limanos ala Pesach. Join up with us, and you can be part of our group that's having a Korban Pesach. Uvalayla, and now when they're sitting at the Seder at night, chazru ala kriya azos leimor, they repeated that invitation again, meaning to the guests who have joined them, they repeated that. And they say, hechraznu kvar kodem shchitas Pesach. We already made an announcement earlier today before the Pesach was slaughtered. Alazmanos lishtatev bo kedazu chedin. They're testifying at the Pesach Seder. When we say, Kol ditzrich yeseh v'yifsach, anyone who needs, come join us for Pesach, that's not the first time they're making the announcement because it's too late at that time. Rather, what they're doing is it's like they're giving edus, they're testifying, Hashem, listen to us. We have already invited any Jew who's in need who didn't have their own Korban Pesach to come join us. That's Am Yisrael. We want to make sure everyone is included. That's what we're doing when we say that. So then he says, V'chein osifu, not only did they add the line, for once Ezra and Nehemiah brought Jews back to Israel, not only did they add the line of Kol ditzrich yeseh v'yifsach, but then they also added that final line of Hashta Avdei L'Shana Haba B'nei Chorin. Now, even though we've come back to Israel, we're still in a state of Avdus, we're still subservient to another foreign leader. L'Shana Haba B'nei Chorin. Next year we want to be in Israel, but we want to be totally free. Hainu Tfilas Yehudei Eretz Yisrael. This was the hope and prayer of every Jew who had gone back with Ezra and Nehemiah. Achozrim L'Artzam, who had returned to Israel. El Shem Adayin Avdei Malchei Parasu Madai. They still were beholden to taking orders from the kings of the Persian Empire. Shalashana Abba, they were praying next year, Niya B'nei Chorin, we want to be totally free. We want to cut all strings, nothing tying us back to Parasu Madai, to the Persian Empire. We want to have absolute liberty, absolute freedom. We want to be making our own decisions. We want to have autonomy. But nonetheless, the majority of the Jewish people still remained behind in the exile in the Persian Empire. They never changed the original text. In other words, so now he's saying, okay, so if Judaism evolved and now Ezra and Nehemiah went back, why didn't they just do away with the parts that were written for Chutz La'aretz? Answer is most of the Jewish community still lived in Chutz La'aretz at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So instead, they couldn't take that part away because that was relevant to most of Judaism. So in honor of the Jews that went back, 2 lines were added that talk about the Jews who had returned to Israel in the second Pesach Haggadah times. That's how he's making sense of this. And that's why it was set up for all generations in the text that we see it in our Haggadah. Lashon Kaful, it's a double expression. Arasher Bonei Yerushalayim, until Hashem finally brings the ultimate redemption and rebuilds Jerusalem, which doesn't just mean that what we see today, that's beautiful, it's a great start, but it's a tease. A rebuilt Jerusalem means the Beis HaMikdash is rebuilt. And the Nidche, Bonei Yerushalayim Hashem, God rebuilds Jerusalem, and Nidche Yisrael Yechanes, and all of the scattered remnants of Israel are regathered. V'yivna lanu es Beis HaBechira b'mehera b'yameinu amen. And he rebuilds for us our holy Beis HaMikdash speedily in our days. So I thought this was fascinating. I never really stopped and thought about all those contradictions that exist in that paragraph. But what Rabbi Sorotzkin did for us here is he really opened up for us. He opens it up with Jewish history and he explains it, that it was originally written for the Jewish community in Galus Bavel. And then when Ezra and Nehemiah went back with a minority, 40,000 Jews, the ultimate mass majority of Bnei Israel stayed back. They did not go back. So they kept the original text and just added 2 lines in honor of those Jews who went back to Israel. But that's fascinating how he has it. And he says, this is the nusach we're left with. I just want to say what's so nice about this is that I remember years ago reading from Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau. It was actually in his autobiography. Shelley Kotleroff, Mrs. Shelley Kotleroff just led us Young Israel's book read. And we had a fabulous discussion about this in our house the other week. We were talking about Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau's autobiography. And in that autobiography, he talks about this, that there was one point where he was leading a Pesach Seder at a major Air Force base in Israel. And one of the pilots was, very macho pilot, basically said, this wasn't written for us. Look at this paragraph of Halach Mania. He says, this is written for people living outside of Israel. I'm a Sabra. I was born in Israel and I never left Israel. What does that mean? This year I'm here. Next year I want to be in Israel. I never left Israel. And what does it mean? Hashta Avdi, L'shana ba b'nei Farim. Now we're servants. Next year I want to be free. He says, I fly jet fighters. Don't tell me I'm a servant. I'm not subservient to anybody. So he was, he publicly asked him this and he silenced the room. And Rabbi Lau was thinking on his feet very quickly. And what he answered the fellow was, he says that's an excellent question. And what he said to him was that we have to think about others. It's not just thinking about ourselves. You're right. You may never have left Israel, but there are thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews who never had the chance to come to Israel yet, whether they were the Soviet refuseniks or whether the Jews who are so lost to assimilation, they're cut off from Israel. And you're right, you might be free flying around in your fighter jet, but think about all those Jews who are those Soviet refuseniks. Them, they don't have anything of that nature. And what this paragraph is doing is teaching us to think about others, not just ourselves. That was how Rabbi Lau explained it. And now that I'm saying this over, I don't think that was in his autobiography. I think that was in a sefer, one of his Hebrew Sfarim that I have a copy of here at the house. I don't think that was in the autobiography. I take that back. But in his autobiography, he does talk about very memorable Pesach Sdarim that he spent with the Air Force and with the Army. But that particular incident I just said over, I don't think that was in the autobiography. That was my mistake. But anyhow, what that pilot was asking Rabbi Lau was, he was looking at this paragraph and he says, this doesn't make sense. It's not speaking to me. Rabbi Sorotzkin's bothered by some of those questions, but look how he makes sense of it. He says, yes, it was originally written for the Jews of Galus Bavel, but they did include some sentences in there for the Jews who had returned. And it's this composite. That's what it is. It's a collection of times in the Jewish experience. And that's the way it was molded. That's the way it's set. And it's going to stay that way until HaKadosh Baruch Hu brings the ultimate redemption. When all of Bnei Israel are back in Eretz Yisrael, where we belong, when we have a Beis HaMikdash, then it will make sense to amend the text of Halach Mania. But until then, this is where it is. And this explains it, how it historically developed. I thought that was fascinating. Let's move on. Let's see this next one. This next one gave some great insight. We know as the Haggadah progresses, what it basically does is it has Chazal darshaning, saying explanations to just a couple of sentences that you find in the Torah. The Torah tells us that when someone would bring bikurim, their first fruits of the season, they would bring them to Yerushalayim, to the Beis Hamikdash, and they would come to the Kohen, and they would come with a basket of their first fruits, and they would put them down in the Beis Hamikdash, and they would make a declaration. And that declaration of Arami Yoved Aviv, Mitzrayim, Vayanuv, Shomim Semat, all that was the declaration, and most of our Haggadah is built around darshaning, explaining that declaration. So let's look at the line that says Vayanunu, that the Egyptians oppressed us, Kamoshin Emar, as it says in the Torah, Vayisimu alav sarei misim, they put taskmasters over us, Lamana noso b'sivlosam, to oppress us with heavy burdens. But even arei miskanos leparo, and we were forced to build storage cities, like warehouse cities for Paro, as Pisom vas Ramses. The names of those two cities were Pisom and Ramses. So look what Rabbi Sorotzkin does here. He really opens up this idea about just what was so wrong about this. But even arei miskanos leparo, Sorotzkin says, think about this for a minute. We're saying that our ancestors were forced to build these storage, these massive warehouse centers. Ubano karoi beis otsaria laparo, Targum Unclus. So Unclus says in Aramaic, what does that mean? Ubanu, we built karoi beis otsaria laparo. Our ancestors built these massive warehouses for Paro. So now he writes as follows: Beis otsar. What do you do with a warehouse in the ancient world? Samim, you place in it kesef azav. You either place in there the riches that Paro accumulated, or tavua, or all the grain that he accumulated. Ve'ela ve'ela, whichever one it was that was getting loaded into those warehouses. Ela ve'ela bola Paro al yidei Yosef. Why did Paro have so much money coming his way that he needed new treasury buildings? Why did he have so much grain coming his way that he needed these new warehouses? It all was because of Yosef. Yosef was responsible for enriching Paro. He set up a system during the years of plenty before the famine kicked in that Paro and the government became fabulously wealthy. They collected all of the money, not just from Mitzrayim, but the entire region. Asher bo loshever lishbar bar b'Mitzrayim. Everyone who came to purchase food in Mitzrayim for the entire region, Mitzrayim became very wealthy. This was all Yosef's doing that Mitzrayim became so wealthy. Paro, and it was all that wealth, it needed to be stored somewhere, so it was kept under lock and key. It was like the Fort Knox of its time. It was all put in Paro's Beis Otzar, in his warehouse. When the Jewish slaves were put to work building the warehouse cities in Pisom and Ramses, some Paro as hakesef v'azavbo. What went into those warehouses? All the money, all the gold and silver that was flooding into Mitzrayim, Paro put it there. V'shina shemo l'Baal Tzifon, and he changed the name. That's how he's learning that. We know that there was a place called Baal Tzifon, which was where the last station where the Jews were at before they left Egypt. So it says they camped out before Baal Tzifon before heading out into the wilderness. So Paro changed the name of those cities, Pisom and Ramses, to Baal Tzifon. If they were used to also put all the grain that he collected, hello gam ibala Paro, that also came to Paro's hands, into his control, mehachomesh, from the fifth, shehenig Yosef al admas Mitzrayim leParo. Remember, Yosef put a rule in place that all farmers had to give a fifth of their yield of their crops to Paro. So look at the rottenness of this new king who enslaved the Jewish people. He put this decree on the children and on the brothers, the family of Yosef, livnos bezeas apam, to build with the sweat of their brow, ubidmei b'neim, and with the blood of their children, al yidei avodas parach, through this backbreaking, crushing labor, shein dugmasa, that there was no comparison to. Mivtzarim, they were building these massive cities, warehouse cities, k'dei lasim b'hem es hakesef v'azav v'tfua, so they could store the gold and the silver and all the grain, shu rachash, that he did accumulate, v'rochev, and he continued to accumulate, hodos l'chachmaso v'charitzaso shel Yosef, all based on the skill and the smarts and the ingenuity of Yosef. So he's saying, look at the torture that was involved. It's not just that there was backbreaking work, But the Jews know what's going to happen with these warehouses. They're storing all of the riches and all of the food. Why does Mitzrayim have so much riches? Why does Mitzrayim have this massive surplus of food? It all was Yosef. So here it is. It's psychological torture. It's not just the backbreaking labor, but it's the mindset that they're thinking, look what's going on here. They should be hugging us. They should be kissing us. They should be thanking us for all the wealth, this prosperity that Egypt is experiencing. It's all because of our Zayda. It's all because of Yosef, our great uncle, whoever, every member of Bnei Yisrael was related. It was our kinsman. It was our family. And instead of giving us a Yasher Koach, instead of giving us some kind of honorary citizenship, they put us to work slave labor, building the warehouses that will hold all of the profits that they're getting because of our family. So that, just imagine the psychological torture. That's Vayanunu. That's what Rabbi Sorotzkin saying. It's not just the backbreaking labor, but it's the mindset that went into it. And that's so true. When Jews feel, when anyone felt over the years and persecution that our people discovered, it's terrible to be persecuted. And the backbreaking labor and the punishment they experienced was awful. But what makes that so much worse is that psychological oppression. To know that not just are we not appreciated, but the ingratefulness and to be diminished to the point where they're building, slaving away and building the storehouses that are going to store all the riches and all of the wealth and all the food that Mitzrayim is only experiencing and only gaining as a result of Yosef HaTzadik. That psychological torture added so much to this, and that's Vayanunu. That's how we were oppressed. Something, just a new insight into that line in the Haggadah that really made me say, wow, I don't think I ever thought of that before. I want to share with you two more points from Rabbi Sorotzkin. They're going on this next part in the Haggadah. It says, Vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha, that the Egyptians put on us all sorts of backbreaking, terrible work. Kamash Amar, and it says, what's the proof text? Vayavidu Mitzrayim es bnei Yisrael b'farach, that the Egyptians oppressed, they worked the Jewish people b'farach with great deal of oppression. So let's see what Rabbi Sorotzkin says in that first paragraph there. Es bnei Yisrael b'farach. So Chazal learned that what does b'farach allude to? B'peh rach, which means with a soft mouth. That Chazal tell us that we were kind of duped into it. The Egyptians started this program saying, basically, if you want to prove your patriotism to Paro, show up. We need volunteer laborers. We need people who are going to come and work to show your commitment to the state. And Jews, because they were recent immigrants, they wanted nothing more than to show we were the greatest flag-waving Egyptians out there. So Jews showed up en masse. And once they were there, and once they were in the rosters, it was slowly, it was a process. They were basically how they became slaves. They didn't just wake up one morning and go from liberty to slavery. They first volunteered, and then slowly the Egyptians started taking away their options and turning the screws and turning them into slaves. So that's how Chazal learned it, because Befarach, which could literally mean that they worked with terrible oppression, but it could also mean Bapeh Rach, with a soft mouth. They were duped into this. They were, so to say, seduced into becoming laborers. So let's see what Rabbi Sorotzkin does with this. He says, B'chol makom shnamar b'farach, whenever the Torah uses the expression of b'farach, he gives you two examples. It says, lo sirda bo b'farach. It says, it's talking about if a Jew sells himself into indentured servitude because he was broke or because he had stolen and didn't have the money to pay it back. So it says, lo sirda bo b'farach. We're not allowed to, work him to the bone. We have to treat him like a mensch, like a regular worker, but we can't treat him doing vicious, backbreaking labor. And then it also says, lo yurdenu b'farach. So befarach never means beperach, with some kind of seducing language to convince someone to do work that ends up getting much tougher. It always means with backbreaking labor. So why here did Chazal say, befarach? It's an allusion to this sweet talking that the Egyptians did, how they duped us and tricked us into becoming slaves. Why here did they do this? Nowhere else do they darshan that way. Befarach always means backbreaking labor. That's Rabbi Sorotzkin's question. So he says, Akol modim, everyone admits, shezoi avoda kasha, that the literal translation of befarach is terribly hard work. Hamafareches mishaberes esaguf, that breaks the back, breaks the body. The lama hotziu po chazal es amila mipashtua, mipshuta. Why here did our sages take the word out of its literal translation and say, oh, there's this whole limud here, beferach. Beferach means that they sweet talked us into this. Why they do that? So here's what he says. Mipnei shekasha lomar. It's very difficult to say, shebnei malachim, that Bnei Yisrael, who started off as princes, because they were all family of Yosef, nevchu pisom la'avadim, suddenly were turned into slaves. They went from 0 to 60, that the Egyptian totally turned on them. They went one day, the Jews were treated like princes, the next day they're slaves. They went to the bottom of the strata of society, without having any type of rebellion. How's that possible? How's it possible that the Jews just went from top to the very bottom without any type of revolt, without any type of protest? Afilu el Hashem lo tzaku, and they didn't cry out to God. Ad she'avru yamim rabim. The first time we see that they start crying out to God is when they're so oppressed after the king dies, and now a new king comes and is treating them even more harsh. How's it possible that they went from being treated like princes to all of a sudden to being on the bottom rung of society, and they didn't scream out to God? It doesn't make sense that this could have happened. It took years into the slavery where they started to slaughter Jewish children so he could bathe in their blood. That's what Chazal tell us, that what made them start crying out. It took that long. If they had been pampered princes and thrown into terrible slavery, they would have cried out much sooner. Therefore, Chazal, the only way to explain this, how is it possible that Jews who lived, so to say, were living the high life and then become slaves, how did that evolve? That's why Rav Elazar explains this through his drasha, but perach, that beperach means, how did it happen? Meaning, how did it happen? How did it evolve? If it was 0 to 60 that the Jews went from being treated as princes to slaves, there would have been this crazy outcry, not just to the Egyptians, but to God. But we don't find anything like that. The only way it could happen is that it happened slowly. Paro created this evolution with incredible amount of cunning and wisdom. He started off this, Chazal understand it. He made an announcement. Our nation needs warehouses. If you really want to prove you're a loyal citizen, you should get involved in this work. Who does it really behoove to show their loyalty to the land? It's certainly on the sojourners, the people who aren't full-blown citizens, weren't born here, just coming through. They're the ones who have the greatest debt to show their loyalty. Ubefrat, and especially Kishehem Yehudim, certainly if they're Jews. You can almost sense here that what he's saying is the irony about how this is played out throughout time, throughout history. The greatest patriots, the ones who feel the most obligatory sense of proving their patriotism, is always the newcomer. It's always the immigrant, and it's always the Jew, because the Jew's always wondering, how am I being viewed? Am I being viewed as a citizen? What do they think of me? So I got to show I'm even more patriotic than the local guy. That's what Rabbi Sorotskin's saying. So Chazal tell us that Paro started off, he himself went out with a brick hanging around his neck. Initially, the government was paying anyone who could make bricks, will pay you for them. And he quotes that's a Medrash Hagadol, and he was paying all the laborers great wages. And finally, what happened? It was a slow evolution. They pay less, they pay less, they pay less. Eventually, they put taskmasters and officers over them. But it wasn't overnight. It was a long evolving process. They broke them down slowly until they made them into slaves. Before the Jews know what hit them, there's every day they slid a little bit further into slavery, and then finally one day they're terrible slaves. But it didn't happen overnight. It was a long process. So he's saying that's why Rav Elazar felt the need to say that when it says Befarach here, it doesn't mean what it means in the rest of the Torah. It has to be darshan, because there's no other way to explain this. How else did the Jews, how did this happen? That the Jews were suddenly turned from princes to slaves, and they don't even open their mouth and protest, not even crying out to God? We don't find that happens until they're enduring terrible hardships, that their kids are being slaughtered. So that's what he says. It must be befarach means beferach, that they were seduced, they were sweet talked into this. That's how he explains that. I thought that was very nice. Let's look at one more small piece at the end. It says as Bnei Yisrael befarach. So it says, if you look back at the pasuk, the proof text, it says vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha. They put on us difficult labor. It says vayavidu Mitzrayim. All of Egypt worked us as Bnei Yisrael, the Jewish people, befarach, with backbreaking labor. So he says as Bnei Yisrael befarach uchidei lishbor es rucham. In order to break the psyche, break the pride, break the spirit of the Jews, the geusam, and any feeling of self-respect and dignity that they had, Shal Yisrael, of the Jews, lo istapek paro b'ma shenasu lavadav livnos mivtzarav. It did not stop by just authorizing the Jews to be slaves to build his warehouses. Ella she'ibedosam l'chol mitzri. He gave license to every true Egyptian to enslave Jews and put them to work for their own needs. Lasos kol malachto b'bayis ubasadeh. It started off as being involved in national projects, building warehouses, maybe making roads, stuff like that. But once that happened, the Paro wanted to break down whatever feelings of dignity and self-worth the Jews had. So they said, not only are you slaves to the state, okay, because maybe they could say, okay, we're somewhat important, we're slaves to the state, but now every Egyptian has the right to enslave you and put you to work. So you're slaves to common Joe the plumber, whoever the guy is, whatever fellow, whatever strata of society someone may be, he could take a Jew and force him to do work for him. That was the greatest breaking of their dignity. And in the home, in the field, in order to cast the Jewish people, to degrade them further and break their spirit, they could be enslaved by every sicko, every last, lowest of the low Egyptian could take a Jew and force him to work for him. And this also allowed the Egyptians to raise their spirits and make them feel like masters, because now they could bully around and they could enslave other people that would make them feel all high on themselves and make the Jews feel so little. That's what the pasuk means. Vayavidu Mitzrayim es bnei Yisrael befarach. It's not just that the government made them into slaves, but Mitzrayim, the entirety of the people. Every Egyptian was given license to, you see a Jew and you need some stuff done, you could force him to work for you. So it's not just the king and his servants who enslaved us. Elagamis avodas hamitzrim, ha'am, the just plain Jane Egyptian had the right to do whatever they wanted to Jews. And that was just backbreaking. When you see something like this, and it's beautiful with the pasuk, Vayavidu Mitzrayim, it was all of Egypt worked us so hard. That's what he's saying there. And when you see something like this, it makes us realize just those Dalet Lashonos of Geula. We have 4 cups of wine at the Pesach Seder, because God told us in 4 different expressions that we were going to be redeemed from Egypt. Botsesi, v'itzalti, v'ga'alti, v'lakachti, those 4 expressions of liberty that God used when he told us that we were going to be taken out of slavery and brought to, and given our freedom. And the commentaries go on to say that each one of them took us to a different level, because we were so degraded. We felt so enslaved. We had such a slave mentality. There were 4 different experiences that we had to go through, 4 different steps of salvation, you might say, in order to totally shed that image and that self-worth that we had, feeling so low about ourselves and being slaves. That's what was necessary. And when you see something like this, it helps explain it, because it was so low. It wasn't just that, okay, we were slaves to Paro or slaves to his government, but that every Jack and Jane, every lowlife out there, every dog catcher, whoever they are on the lowest rung in a totem pole, was given license to enslave a Jew and make them do whatever menial tasks were needed. That must have been so degrading and makes people feel so low. We needed so much. Hashem had to take us out of Mitzrayim and to take away that slave mentality for us, which had seeped in after so many years of oppression. These are just a few of the insights that I was going to share with you this year from Rabbi Sorotskin on the Haggadah. As I said, his Haggadah is called Ashir V'Shavach. He has more insights, and hopefully in coming years, we'll be able to share more of them together. I want to take this opportunity, both Layla and I want to wish everybody We want to wish everybody a Chag Kosher v'Sameach. We want to wish you having a beautiful Pesach. It should be a real a celebration of Geula, and God willing, our Chazal tell us, B'Nisan Nigalu, our people was originally redeemed in the month of Nisan, V'Nisan Asidin Ligael, and it's in the month of Nisan that people will experience the ultimate redemption.
You on?
I'm here.
See that day soon. All right, everyone, have a wonderful day. Have a